So, good evening, everyone. My name is Martin Hamilton. I'm Director of Leeds Civic Trust. And I'm delighted this evening to welcome Jacki and Bob Lawrence, who are going to give us a talk on Montague Burton, Tailor of Taste. A figure that is obviously a key one in the history of Leeds, but a key one nationally, and I dare say even internationally. So I know we're all looking forward to hearing more about the life of Montague Burton and Burtons more generally. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speakers this evening. They're going to share the screen. Just to say, the way this will work is I will disappear shortly from the camera. So you'll just have Jacki and Bob speaking. And then towards the end, or at the end, I will reappear by magic. And at that point, we're happy to take any questions. So please do use the chat function on the Zoom if you want to put any questions. If anything occurs to you during the course of the talk, please post them on the chat function. Any comments you wish to pass, some of you may have worked for Burtons, you may have some interesting stories. Please use the chat function to pass those on. And at the end of the talk, as I say, we'll wrap up with a few questions. So without further ado, Jacki and Bob.
Thank you, Martin. Good evening, everybody. Well, as Martin said, we're going to talk about Montague Burton tonight. And he was a huge influence in Leeds. But he didn't come from Leeds. He wasn't even born in England. And he wasn't called Montague Burton to start with. So who was he? We're going to look at his life, and we're going to see that no matter what he achieved in later life, and it was a very great deal, he was a very modest man. What interest could I be to anybody? I am no different from any other Jew in Leeds. Well, this is something he said to a Jewish reporter, a reporter from the Jewish Record. And it just underlines the nature of the man who created the largest multiple-tailoring organisation the world has ever seen. I think that statement was a bit of an understatement. In fact, I think it couldn't have been farther from the truth. Over a 30-year period, from very humble beginnings, and with a loan of £100, he built a clothing empire which catered for 25% of the male population of this country, an achievement considered by some even today to be like parallel throughout industrial history. Meshe David Osinski was born on the 13th of August 1885 in Kirkel in the Kovno province of Lithuanian Russia. He was the son of Hyman Yehuda and Rachel Elke Osinski. Sadly, his father died when he was 8 years old, and he went to live with his uncle, his father's brother, Solomon Osinski. In his later years, he studied at the Slobodka Yeshiva and was regarded as an outstanding scholar, and he was educated in a wide range of subjects. He was regarded as an expert on the Talmud. At the age of 15, fleeing anti-Semitic pogroms and armed with £100, which is believed he borrowed from his uncle, he managed to leave Russia and arrived in England in 1900. So here we have the young Maurice Montague Burton. He came into via Hull probably, and when he got here, he couldn't speak a word of English. So he's 15 years old, in a strange country, doesn't understand the language, and he sets about learning the language and making a life for himself, making a career. And his first action was to start peddling round the houses. So he was a hawker, really. And at that time, he was so very poor that he couldn't even afford to get his boots mended. And he was actually tramping the streets with his boots tied up with string. In 1903, he managed to open his first shop in Chesterfield, and he was trading as the Cross Trailing Company. In order to educate himself at this time and to learn about England and English culture, he used to borrow his landlady's daughter's homework books every night and start poring over them in his lodgings in the evenings. By the time he'd opened his second shop in 1904 in Mansfield, he was becoming known as Maurice Montague Burton. By 1910, he had 19 shops stretching from Chesterfield to Manchester. Sorry, he had 10 shops stretching from Chesterfield to Manchester. And he was buying his goods from wholesale manufacturers in Leeds, because he wasn't manufacturing at this point, he was purely retail. And I'll just give you some examples of the kind of things he was selling in his shop. Rugby suits were retailing at 7 and 6pence. Boys' suits were 9 and 6pence. Vicuna suits were 11 and 9pence. And tweed suits were 15 and 6. He got married on the 23rd of March 1909 to Sophia Amelia Marks. Her father was Maurice Marks. This is not the Marks of the Marks family of Marks and Spencers. That was Michael Marks. So her father was called Maurice Marks. It was a long and happy marriage, and they had 4 children. Barbara, born in 1909, Stanley, born in 1914, and the twins Raymond and Arnold, born in 1917. Now, here's a lovely picture of the wedding, and you can see actually that he's not a very tall man. Even with his top hat on, he's only as tall as his wife. But what he lacked in inches, he certainly made up for in stature. And here are the children. Barbara standing in the centre, Stanley seated, and the twins either side, Raymond and Arnold. The year after his marriage, he became a naturalised citizen of Britain. And here's a copy of his naturalisation certificate. And you can see that he's taken the name Montague Burton, Maurice Burton. And he got his naturalisation certificate on the 14th of February, 1910. By 1911, you can see from the 1911 census, he's living in Sheffield with his wife Sophia and his daughter Barbara. 1914, First World War starts. He doesn't go to war because by this time he's got several shops, so he's a very significant employer, so his place is at home. It's round about this time during the war that he drops the Maurice from his name and just becomes known as Montague Burton. By the end of the war, his brother Bernard has come to join him. And at this point, Montague decides to go into the manufacturing business because he's come to realise that he can't rely on the manufacturers that he's buying from in Leeds. Either they're late with the goods, they're too expensive, they're not the quality that he wants. So he decides to take a step back and go into manufacturing. So he goes into business with his brother, Bernard, and they're trading as Burton and Burton. And he opens 5 small factories or manufacturing units in Leeds. The head office was at Concord Street, and the others were at Byron Street Mills, Woodhouse Lane, Melbourne Street, and Milroyd Street. By 1919, he had 60 shops, and that's the year that he moved to Leeds. He subsequently moved to Harrogate, but in 1919, he came to live in Leeds. His greatest achievement was to open the Hudson Road Mills. He began building of this in 1921, and the whole complex was completed by 1934. It was a huge site, it was over 100 acres, and it was the largest clothing factory in the world. Now, Montague Burton's unique selling point at this time was that they were making a made-to-measure suit for the same price as other manufacturers were making an off-the-peg suit. So for the first time, the ordinary working man could afford to have a made-to-measure suit. Bob's going to explain this photo to you.
Well, hi everybody. Well, when Sir Montague actually came to this site, the first thing he saw, and he wrote it down, was it was an awful lot of rhubarb fields, fireclay works, poultry farms, and market gardens. And over a period of 2 or 3 years, he had people working here, and then he expanded right down to this section here. So by 1934, this was the size of the factory. It was very large indeed. It was situated in Bermontops. Here we've got Stony Rock Lane just coming down here. Hudson Road itself is going along there, right up to Lupton Avenue. Then he goes down Lupton Avenue, And right at the bottom of the site, which is off this picture, is Torry Road. Now, this is the factory itself where all the workrooms were. And all the workrooms were on the top floor. This side of the factory was the cutting room, this section here. Next to that was the trouser room, and up at the top of the trouser room was the waistcoat making department. Next door to that was coat room number 2, and then next door to that was coat room number 1, and then finally we had final pattern and quality control and the dispatch room. And this is where everything was kept prior to being loaded onto the vans to be sent to all the branches. On the ground floor, we had the Princess Royal Canteen here, a massive canteen, took all this section up. And from there, right almost as far as the loading bay was the actual cloth warehouse. Now, what you can't see on this photograph is a small door here. And if you went in down this door, you'd go into a fully equipped gymnasium that had indoor cricket nets, showers and baths for anybody who went down there training. Also down there was a billiard room which had 5 full-size tables. If you look outside of the top of this picture, here you've got a bowling green. On either side of it, you had a putting green. And behind this, off the picture, you'd hard surface tennis courts. This building here is called Trent House, and that was built in the 1960s. Prior to that, the girls used to play netball on the top of there. Below that was a cricket field with a 400-metre track round it that had sports every year. Below the sports track was a football field, followed by another football field below that, and right at the bottom, facing onto Torry Road, was a rugby field. This section here that you can see, which is a little bit darker, was nothing to do with Montague Burton's. It was John Crockett's, the dry cleaners. But next door to it, up at the top end here, that did belong to Burton's, and that became the design and planning department and also research and development. This street here, you could enter the site there. It's called West Lock Avenue, and Burton's did own some of the properties along here, and some of the employees did actually rent them. And this area here is the actual car park. This section up at the top is, all this section is to do with shop fitting and ancillary trades that were used to fit out all the branches and things like that. And next door to it here were the garages where all the wagons were stored. Right.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So here's the main entrance to the Hudson Road Mill site. This is a later photograph because you can actually see so it does have the Arcadia Group logo on it, which Burton Group did become Arcadia Group in later years. But at the top you can see the original Burton logo. He wanted to build this site so that he could get all of his 5 smaller manufacturing units together in one place. And it was a superb building. It was designed by Nathaniel Martin, who was a well-known industrial architect. They managed to move all the 5 smaller operations together into the Hudson Road site over one weekend so that they didn't lose any production. And as I said, the factory was fantastic, and it had all the latest equipment, state-of-the-art equipment, and it could hold 10,000 employees. Now, Montague Burton was a very conscious employer in terms of the welfare of his employees, and he had all kinds of things to help look after his staff, to make life easier for his staff. For example, there were several canteens on the site. There were 3 canteens on the site. The largest one, the Princess Royal Canteen, was opened on the 9th of October 1934, and this was the main canteen for the factory workforce. It could seat 8,000 people. There was also a director's dining room and a staff canteen. But he didn't only have canteens. He had doctors on site, he had chiropodists, he had nurses, there was a dentist, there was a sunray room, there was everything for his employees. He employed a cordon bleu chef to oversee the meals in this canteen. And there's a rather funny story about this chef, because one day Zoe Arnold, who was a member of his executive team, member of Montague Burton's executive team, suggested to the chef that he should start serving fish and chips in the canteen. And the chef was so incensed, he chased her out of the kitchen brandishing a carving knife. But the food in the canteen was of the very highest quality. And in fact, one day there was a visiting dignitary who was being treated to his lunch in the director's dining room, and he commented that he was being given the same food to eat as the workforce. And Montague Burton said, "If it wasn't good enough for my guests, it would not be good enough for the workers who make the business. The workers here are not hands, they are individuals." So, you know, he just had their best interests at heart. The canteen was very highly subsidised. The canteen didn't make a profit, everything was sold at cost. And for employees who were under the age of 16, they actually got free meals. So this is a picture of the opening of the canteen with Sir Montague Burton, Princess Royal, and the Lord Mayor of Leeds. Now, here's the view of the large canteen. This is only a section, a very small section of it. It really doesn't do it justice. As I say, it could seat 8,000 people. So you could stand at one end of it and you could barely see the far end of it. And here it is filled with employees. 10,000 people were fed in this canteen every lunchtime in an hour and a half. Here's a picture of one of the kitchens. Again, everything in the kitchens was of the very highest order. All the dishwashing machines and electric ovens and anything like that. It was all the best equipment that money could buy. We're also going to look now at some of the other welfare facilities that were available on site. So there was a first aid department where there was always a sister or a nurse on duty, or sometimes a doctor, because obviously in a factory there may be small incidents and accidents, or people may just be generally unwell, so they could come down to the first aid department if that was the case. Here's also one of the restrooms, there was 2 or 3 restrooms. This is the ladies' restroom. So again, if someone had been involved in an accident, after they'd been to visit the nurse and been treated, they could come into here for a short time to rest and recuperate. Or if they were just feeling unwell at their work, they could come down and spend some time here. There was also an optician, and there was also a dentist, and there was also a sunray room where people could have sunray treatment under strict medical supervision. Now, the reason these were all on site was not only because it made it easier for the staff, but because it also ensured that there was no loss of production, because instead of a member of staff having to take half a day off to go have a dentist appointment or something like that, they could simply take half an hour out of their working day and come down to the on-site facilities. So it was a win-win situation as far as the staff and the management were concerned. There were quite a few famous athletes that worked for Burton's. Beryl Burton, the cyclist, worked there. Doris Story, the swimmer, worked there. And Alan Lawton, who was quite a good marathon runner, he also worked at Burton's. And famous people came to visit Burton's. Now, if it was a male visitor that was coming to Burton's, the first thing that happened when they got on site was that they were measured up for a suit, and they chose the materials and the linings and so on. And by the time they had the tour of the factory, which was, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, they were presented with a fully made up suit. So here we see a picture of Don Bradman, who was visiting one time, being measured for a suit. Here's England cricketer Bill Bowles, also being measured for a suit, just before his departure to Australia in September 1932. 2 years later, in 1934, Burton's made the suits for the entire visiting Australian cricket team. Now, by this time, Montague Burton was becoming known internationally. And in fact, in 1931, he was knighted for furthering the cause of industrial relations and industrial peace, international peace. So Montague was very keen on brand and image. So all of the shops had the same frontages. Everything looked the same typeface, and they were instantly recognisable. The shops had beautiful green granite frontages with gold lettering, and whichever town you were in, you could easily spot and recognise the Burton shop. Some of the larger ones had billiard halls above them, and there were two reasons for this. Firstly, Sir Montague was a teetotaler, and he thought that by providing billiard rooms, it may have prevented men from going to the pub. But the other reason, and this was probably more significant for Montague Burton, was that it was a marketing ploy. If men were coming to go onto the billiard rooms, they had to pass the front of the shop with all the wares on display, and perhaps they would be encouraged to go in the shop and buy something. So it was a two-pronged attack when you have the billiard rooms. Here's an artist impression of the Burton store that was at the bottom of Duncan Street and Briggate. I'm sure some of you will remember it. I certainly do. In 1939, when the Second World War broke out, Montague Burton was living in Harrogate with his wife, and one of the twins, Raymond, was still at home, and his daughter Barbara was also living with him, but she was married at that time, but she was living with him. Now, Burton's played a very significant part in the war effort. One of the things that they did was that they provided the funds, the management and all the employees provided the funds to pay for a Spitfire. And the Spitfire was presented to the Royal Air Force in 1940. It was named the Montague B. It was passed on to a Polish squadron, and it did quite a few sorties over France. It was then passed on to the Canadian Air Force and became used as a training aircraft. At the beginning of the war, Burtons were clothing 25% of the male population of the UK, and they immediately moved over to producing military clothing. So they were providing the Air Force, the Navy and the Army. And in fact, throughout the course of the war, they made over 1.5 million garments. They also made for the Americans and the other allies, but the numbers, I don't know the numbers for those. 279 men from the Burton organisation were killed during the war. 62 men and women received gallantry awards. And when they were at when the people were at war, Montague Burton ensured that any of his staff who was serving had their wages made up to what they would have been earning had they been at the factory, so that their families didn't lose out because the men were serving for their country. At the end of the war, Burton's provided 1/3 of the demob suits that were given to the returning soldiers. And the unique thing about Burton's at the time was that they had large supplies of pre-war materials in their warehouses. And so they were able to provide, for the demob suits, they were able to provide a huge range of fabrics and colours. In fact, 47 different fabrics and colours for the demob suits, whereas other manufacturers that were making demob suits could really only provide, the utility material. At the end of the war, he was employing 18,000 people because by this time he'd bought weaving mills as well. So as well as manufacturing, he was actually producing the materials himself. Now, I've said that Montague Burton's was a significant part of the war effort, and it certainly was. And the German High Command knew that. And here's a copy of a Luftwaffe map, which is showing that Hudson Road Mills was actually a target for the Luftwaffe. Fortunately, they never found it. So the war is finished. We're coming to 1950, and this is the Golden Jubilee year for Sir Montague Burton. there were huge celebrations to mark his 50 years in the business. This is a picture taken of a ball that was held in the big canteen, and you can see that there's Sir Montague surrounded by very many of his employees, probably as many as could squeeze into the picture. Another thing that happened as part of the 1950 celebrations was the opening of the Golden Jubilee playing fields at Trent Road, and this was on 29th of July in 1950. Now, in subsequent years, they used to hold a sports day every summer, and in fact, although it was called a sports day, the event actually happened over a weekend, and so it was actually the Saturday and the Sunday, and it was more like a county show. So there were athletic events, but there was also things like the cake competitions, flower arranging competitions, dressmaking competitions, knitting competitions, photographic competitions. It was a big event, and by this time, certainly by the late 50s, there were 8 factories in part of the Burton Group. There were 4 in Yorkshire, so that was Hudson Road, Goole, Doncaster and Gisborough, and there were 4 in Lancashire: Warrington, Walkden, Bolton and Burtonville. And if you remember, I've said that all of the factories contained the very highest in terms of the equipment that they had. The Burtonville factory was in fact the first factory in Europe to be completely, to have complete, what's the word? It's air conditioning. Sorry, I forgot the word, air conditioning. Yeah. So people came from all of the factories to take part in the open day or the sports day. The second part of the weekend was on Sunday, and it was the annual Lorry Driver of the Year competition. And this was a skills competition for drivers of not only of the Burton lorries, but in fact any big lorries. Companies, other companies took part. My cousin was a tanker driver for a petrol company, and he always took part in the Lorry Driver of the Year competition. So it was open to other companies as well. So we've got here rather a nice picture of a Burton van from the 1950s, but we've also got a picture here of a Burton van from 1925, so which is rather splendid, I think. So now we're going to look at life in the factory, and this is where Bob is going to take over because he works there.
Right, I worked at Hudson Road. Well, no, I didn't. I worked at Burton's for 18 years. But the first part of my life, I was at Hudson Road, of course. The reason I put this letter up is really to show you what was written right at the bottom of the letter here. And it shows that at this time in 1957, Burton's employed 20,000 employees. They also employed 100,000 indirect employees and were paying the highest wages in Europe for our industry. And the business was worth £15 million in capital. In today's money, that's about £308 million. Is it? Yes, £308 million, something like that. This is a copy of the apprenticeship agreement, which I signed back in 1957. Now, in 1957, the population of Leeds was about 500,000. Today, it's about 780,000. So there was an awful lot of industry. Leeds was a thriving industrial city, and there were lots of trades which young school leavers could actually choose from. I reached 15 years of age in March 1957, and in April 1957, I started work as an apprentice measure cutter at Burton's. And I worked at Burton's for 18 years, like I said, starting as an apprentice and then becoming a junior designer and then a quality control manager at Burton's Gisborough factory. Now, the apprentice would start work on a 6-week probation period, being paid a basic wage of £3.7 and 6 for a 44-hour week. And after signing this agreement, the wage rose 5 shillings to £4.2 and 6. And some people might think, crikey, that's not a great deal. But I can show you back in 1957, if a 15-year-old boy was earning £4 2 and 6, that wasn't a bad wage at all. I mean, I had friends in other industries, in engineering and printing and things like that, and they used to remark that I used to get paid more than what they did. Now, after a period of training especially, the apprentice could earn bonus on graduated piecework, and top bonus rates were achieved as the apprentice developed with age, skill and experience. Now we're just going to look at the factory now. Now this first slide is a section of the cloth warehouse, and if you'll note that all the fabrics pieces used to come in all cuddled like this, folded and actually cuddled, which means they were folded like a concertina. These fabric pieces would be booked in, and then they would be sent to the cloth perching and inspection room. Now perching is where they opened out these folded fabrics. You can see the crease down the centre of the fabric there, and they would put them over these rollers and pass them through here. And there were light bulbs in there which would show up any flaws or damages in the fabric. If a flaw was actually located, they would put a small piece of string in the selvage of the cloth, which would make it easier for a cutter to identify it and then avoid it being put accidentally into the actual suit itself, into the actual garment. Now, from the cloth purchasing and inspection room, the fabrics would go to the cut length department, and here orders were sorted, and the suit length would be cut from selected cloths and sent to the cutting room. Now this was the largest cutting room in the world, and this is only a small section of it. And at the time in 1957, it was employing over 700 measure cutters, stock cutters, band knife men, trimmers and apprentices. The room also housed the design department and the pattern cutting section. This was until the mid-60s. This is a photograph of the chief designer, Charles Inman, and he's checking out his design on Jack Moore, who was actually a foreman in the cutting room. This is where the design and planning department moved to, which was on Compton Road. This little road up here is Hudson Road, and I was lucky enough to work in there for 5 years. Here again, we're back to a section of the cutting room, and all these people here are actually measure cutters. Here we've got an individual measure cutters. This chap here is obviously marked it all in and is in the process of chopping it out with hand shears. Here we've got a band knife man. In certain cases for stock work, fabric was actually laid up in layers to maybe about 20 thick. They would be sectioned out, and then they would be cut out on the band knife. Here is cutting belt. The band knife was invented around about 1900 by John Barron, and he got his inspiration from the band saw, but it's a little bit different in that it's a rotary blade that goes all the way around here. You've got one wheel here, one wheel underneath the table there, and another wheel underneath the table here, and it was extremely sharp, and these men were very, very highly skilled. If you notice, he's not wearing any kind of shielding on his hands, which in those days was maybe permissible, but by 1970 and 1980, of course, people had to wear some kind of guard on the hands. Next to the cutting room, we have the trouser room, which employed nearly 3,000 operators. Next to that, we had coat room number 2, that made most of the jackets and made to measure and off the pegs suits. Then we had coat room number 1. This was the hand tailoring department. this chap here was, I remember it was Mr. Oddy, he was a master tailor, and while I was undergoing my training, he actually taught me dresswear tailoring. And then we have the final passing and quality control department, where every garment was looked at and inspected. It would match up with the actual trouser. A bag would be placed onto it, and then it would be shipped into the dispatch room. Now going to show you some photographs of some of the factories. Here we've got the Rawcliffe Road clothing works at Goole. This is the Burtonville factory, which was purpose-built, actually. An absolutely beautiful factory. It was on the East Lancs Road at Worsley, near Manchester. And if you look at the front here, at the top, the actual top of it is shaped like a sewing machine head. And that was on purpose so that people could easily denote it was an actual clothing factory. I can tell you from personal experience, it was a beautiful factory inside. It was an absolute pleasure to visit it. Here we've got the Halliwell Road Clothing Works at Bolton. We also had factories, as Jackie said, at Wharton and Warrington. And this is the Gisborough factory, because I worked here for 7 years. The actual workrooms were down here. Up above it on this side here was the cutting room. Here was the canteen, and during the summer months, employees could sit out here and enjoy the sunshine. Some of them went to play tennis on there. Also in Gisborough was Sunnyfield House. That's the building here. This Burton's bought Sunnyfield House in 1954, and from that time until 1972, they used to run management training sessions, and also training sessions for people who worked in the shops. All the salesmen used to come here for a week, and they would do a training course for a week.
So what was the legacy of Sir Montague Burton? Well, sadly, Sir Montague Burton died in 1952 on the 21st of September while speaking after a dinner in Leeds. The dinner was actually held at the Great Northern Hotel, and it was for his senior management staff. And sadly, he was taken over during his speech after dinner and died. His funeral was held at Chapel Town Synagogue, followed by interment at Gildersham Cemetery, Gelded Road, Leeds, although he was, of course, living in Harrogate at the time that he died. Here's a photograph of the funeral procession, and you can see that thousands of people lined the streets to watch his cortege go by. Sir Montague, as I said, he and his wife were living in Harrogate, and he always thought that Harrogate should have its own Jewish cemetery, but it didn't, not in his lifetime anyway. So him and his wife, Lady Sophia, who died about 5 years after him, were buried in Gildersham Cemetery. But there was a clause in their wills that when a Jewish cemetery was built in Harrogate, they would be reinterred there, and that's what happened. When Stonefall Cemetery opened in 1964, Sir Montague Burton and Lady Sophia were reinterred there, and they were the first burials at that cemetery. And here's a picture of their graves. So sadly, Montague Burton has died, but his empire hasn't died. In fact, it goes on for many, many years, and it goes from strength to strength. The Burton Group merged with Jackson the Tailor shortly after his death, and the two Jacobson brothers, Lionel and Sidney, became joint managing directors. And here we've got a picture of Lionel Jacobson with showing Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip around the factory. And this is another photograph taken on that day, taken by an employee actually, and you can see all the people, all the work people crowding to get a glimpse of Her Majesty the Queen. It's a lovely photo, that one. In 1966, Burton's made the suits for the winning team for the 1960 England World Cup. And here we've got a lovely photograph of the team in their very smart dark charcoal grey suits. You can see that they've got badges on their jackets, and the badges said London 1966. But do any of you remember this badge, World Cup Willie, that we could all buy and wear to support our team when they won the World Cup? Here's the blue plaque, which was obviously provided by Leeds Civic Trust, and it's on the wall at Hudson Road Mills, and it says, Montague Burton, the tailor of taste, making good quality, made-to-measure suits for a week's wages. Burton created a mass market. This Hudson Road headquarters, begun in 1921, was by 1925 the largest clothing factory in the world, eventually employing 10,500 people. So we've looked at what he achieved, but what of himself? What of the man? What was he like? Well, he was a very great reader, and he particularly enjoyed the female authors. So people like Jane Austen and the Brontes and George Eliot, Mrs. Gaskell, they were the female authors that he enjoyed. As well as being a very great reader, he was a very great speaker. He was a great orator, and he was very much in demand as an after-dinner speaker for people like the Rotary clubs and things like that. He was very proud of being Jewish, and he believed that Israel should be rebuilt. He was a magistrate. He was a director of an insurance company. He was life president of Harrogate Synagogue, president of the Leeds Talmud Torah, president of the Judea Club. He supported many charities, both Jewish and non-Jewish. He endowed many chairs at various universities. In 1924, he was asked to become Lord Mayor of Leeds, but he declined this. He didn't want to do that. He wasn't political. He wasn't affiliated to any political party, but he was liberal with a small L. He was a great believer in the United Nations. And in fact, he thought that had there been greater cooperation between the UK and the States in the early 1930s, that perhaps Hitler would not have annexed Austria. He was an honorary Doctor of Letters from Leeds University and a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was a workaholic. He worked an 18-hour day, but he played hard as well. And he used to take 6 weeks to 2 months off every year to go cruising, and he went all around the world and all over the world. Now, he wrote a book about his experiences on his world cruises, and it was called Globe Girdling, Being the Impressions of an Amateur Observer. Now, this book ran to 2 volumes, and it was made up of the diaries that he kept on his cruises and the letters that he wrote home to his daughter Barbara. All the proceeds from the sale of this book were given to charity. So we've just got a couple of pictures from the book of places that he went. So here he is in Singapore, and then we've got one from America. So he's in Hollywood, America, on this photograph. When he visited New Zealand as part of one of his world tours, he was hailed as the largest single customer for wool for that country. So the Burton Group were buying more wool from New Zealand than all of the other customers throughout the world put together. He was an extremely wealthy man, which was only his right because he had worked extremely hard for anything he had. But he could also be very frugal. And for example, he used to reuse envelopes. He used to cross out the addresses on envelopes and reuse them, writing the envelopes and writing the addresses in a different place. And he did this so many times that eventually the post office refused to accept his envelopes. But I think that the character and ethos of the man can be summed up in a quote he gave when he was being interviewed about his charitable work. And he said, "We forget ourselves when we think of others. You have no idea how much happiness we can feel if we are only charitable. The virtues, like 7 lamps, light up the world and everything seems bright." Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. That was absolutely superb. I learned so much there that I'm afraid I never knew. I'm afraid I never knew. I just never knew. And nonetheless, we do have quite a few questions for Jacki and Bob. Now, Jacki and Bob, you have actually gone quite dark now, so I don't know if you want to turn the light on or something. I think the light's just fading, isn't it, a bit, so we can see your faces.
Is that better?
That's better. That's better. So I'm just going to run through these questions not in a particular order, but see if you can maybe answer some of them. So if the first question is, were unions allowed?
Yes, they were. In fact, I was the first apprentice in about 4 years to work for Montague Burton's in 1957, because for about 3 or 4 years before that, Burton was an actual closed shop, and this had been agreed with the trade unions. So I was lucky. But even so, when they started to take apprentices on, which was again agreed with the trade union, that year, 1957, only 4 of us were actually chosen. There was about 36 applicants, but fortunately I was one who got chosen. So, but yes, the trade union was very active, and Sir Montague, and even after he had died, the working management had extremely good relationships with the trade unions. One of the reasons for this, of course, is because whatever kind of wage agreements happened every year, Burton's always used to pay a little bit above that to its employees. Yeah, they were very active with the trade union, but the actual industrial relations within the factory was very, very good indeed.
What kind of sewing machines were used? Were they Singer?
Singer sewing machines, yes, but they also had other machines as well. You can imagine that they had thousands of machines.
Yeah.
And they had automatic machines. In the 70s in particular, when the garment engineering took place, and by garment engineering I mean changing from the old-fashioned craft ways of making a suit into making it in a more modern engineered fashion, there's an awful lot more automatic machinery came into place, and an awful lot of people did lose their jobs because of it.
So thinking about the factory in Leeds, I mean, did people tend to live locally, or did people come from further afield?
People came from further afield. Burton's used to bus people in from, for example, Castleford, Garforth. Yep. Go on, you answer that.
Well, I'm just saying, yeah, you used to see the buses lined up all down Trent Road. You know, when the factory closed for the evening, there used to be, it must have been 10 or 12 buses that were lined up down Trent Road, and all the workforce were getting on it to go to Garforth, Kippocks, or wherever they live. So yeah, he made it easier for people to get to work.
The locations of the different factories, do you know why those particular locations were chosen? Was there any particular reason that we know of?
No, I can't really answer that question. I mean, I went to every one of them lots of times, and they used to employ fairly local people at the outside factories, though. Yeah. You know, so.
I mean, I suppose the Giza factory probably was chosen because it was already geared up for garment production, because it had been a shirt factory before Burton's bought it. Mm. So that probably was an element in choosing Gisborough, but I don't really know the answer to that.
No.
Do you know if there's an archive anywhere, a company archive, that gives the list of people that actually worked there? Or are there any records of those sorts that you're aware of?
I wouldn't know about people who worked there, any record of that. But the West Yorkshire Archives Service, I believe they have a massive archive on the Burton Group. Mm. In this particular talk, we've not explored the actual Burton Group as such, because it's a mountain of information about it. We've just explored a little bit where Sir Montague was involved, and 2 or 3 years afterwards. Also, if you anybody went down to the Leeds Library Services local studies department in town, they also have lots of information about the Burton Group and Sir Montague Burton. So there's 2 sources.
Okay, that's really helpful, thanks. Was any damage sustained to the factory during the war? Do you know?
No,
No,
no.
They missed
wasn't
it.
considered a threat, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, the Luftwaffe did have it as a target, but fortunately they never found it.
Right.
Yeah. The same as Leeds. Leeds was hardly touched compared to
Yeah.
some cities anyway.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Let me just have a look, see what else. Oh yeah, this is an interesting question, and I think Robert Dyson's asking this question, but he knows the answer.
Right.
And he says, is it a coincidence that most, if not all, of the Burton shops were actually on street corners? The one that you showed on Duncan Street, and Briggate was on a corner. Now, I think Robert's theory is, and I don't know if this is true, well, I mean, it certainly is true, that you get the benefit of two different streets that way. You know, you get people walking along Duncan Street and people walking along Briggate. Whereas if it was further down, you only get the one, you know, passing trade from the one street.
Yeah.
But so I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but certainly if if you look around, a lot of their shops, well, I mean, you know, the shop, you know, the one at the top of Briggate now is on the corner, of course.
But they also had a major one in Briggate, right in the middle of Briggate, you know.
Yes.
So they had 660 stores altogether, so throughout the UK.
Yeah. Let me just have a look, see what else we've got here. Whereabouts did he live?
Me.
I mean, in the May. I mean, obviously we know where he was born, but where did he end up sort of living and settling?
What?
I think he lived when he lived in Leeds. I think he lived in Shadwell.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where he lived in when he moved to Harrogate. I don't know.
But he went to Harrogate, didn't he? Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, he went to Harrogate, and that's where he was living when he died.
Let's have a look. Yeah, someone's saying, I had a made-to-measure skirt suit made in the mid-50s. Can't remember how much it cost. Any ideas?
In the mid-50s?
Yeah.
Let me see now. You'd be thinking somewhere in the range of about maybe 12 to 14 pound, depending on the quality, I would think. And I'm just saying that from memory. But there's one thing I can say about the old-fashioned ways of tailoring that were made that way long before sort of garment engineering came in. If you bought a suit made to measure and it had a lovely satin lining in and the inside had a nice Sido canvas, nothing felt quite like it. And really, I've never tried on a modern suit and that's felt exactly the same way. That there was something about a handmade suit, the picture that was made to picture, that was quite special. I mean, I remember I had one, and I had it for years. In fact, eventually I wore it out.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a vote, isn't it? Good vote of confidence in it. Yeah. The Paul Cartwright asks, do we know why in the end they ended up sort of settling in Leeds? Because they started off, you know, outside of Leeds. I mean, what is now South Yorkshire. Do we know why they ended up? Was it just the land was available, or?
Well, he started out in Chesterfield. That's where he was in digs in Chesterfield when he was going door to door. But he did also spend some time in Leeds and Sheffield during his very early years, anyway. And I think he went to Leeds because of the manufacturing. Because he had. Initially, he had all the retail shops, and but he was buying all his goods from manufacturers in Leeds. So I think that's probably what the draw was to Leeds.
I've also seen just flashed up on the screen that was somebody asking about the phrase the full Monty.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we believe this does actually go back to Montague Burton's, and the full Monty goes back to when all the soldiers were actually demobbed after World War II. And they would ask for a full Monty. It was nothing to do with a film or anything like that. But what a full Monty was a jacket, a waistcoat, a pair of trousers, a shirt, and some underwear.
Right.
And that was the full Monty.
Well, there you go. That's the answer to that one, because it's a well-known phrase, of course, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know about going for a Burton? Is that because I know some people say that one isn't related to Burton's phrase, going for a Burton. No.
I can't say I've ever heard of that one.
No.
But I've heard of the phrase, but I don't think it's ever been sort of attributed to Sir Montague or his group.
Jane is suggesting that another reason for gravitating towards Leeds was that Leeds had a large Jewish population and
Yes.
expertise. Yeah.
Yes, it did.
Yeah. Let me just have a look, see what else we've got here. Lots of comments, lots of you know, thank yous, and people really enjoyed the talk.
No,
Lots of chat about that. Now then, I don't know if you, I didn't tell you beforehand because I thought it might put you off your stride, but Jeremy Burton has actually been listening in. Montague Burton was his grandfather.
Right.
And Jeremy Burton says, I'd like to thank Jackie and Bob for a very well-informed talk about my grandfather, Montague Burton. I would be happy to meet you and share some thoughts and images.
Oh, that's very nice.
That's very nice.
I hope we didn't say anything that he found insulting. I don't think we did.
No,
Because,
no,
you know, Montague Burton is very much admired by both of us.
Yeah. The thing is, I met Mr. Stanley Burton on several occasions because when I was working at the factory at Gisborne as quality control manager, he used to come up and inspect the garments with me, and he was extremely informed that there was no way that you could ever try to pull the wool over Mr. Stanley's eyes. And I think that Sir Montague insisted that Mr. Stanley was taught the business right from square one because he was so knowledgeable about the trade.
Mm. Do you have any idea why Maurice Montague Burton chose those names? Is there any?
We get asked that
clue.
every time we do this talk. He could have maybe chosen Maurice because of his father-in-law, because his you know, his father-in-law was called Maurice, so that could have come from there. But other than that, no. And as I say, people ask us that constantly, and we just haven't been able to find the answer to it.
Yeah. Yes, it's one of those things that was decided, you know, at the time, and it could have been anything, couldn't it? It could have been, you know, reading a newspaper. You know, you just don't know, do you?
No.
Let me see if there's anything else on my list. I think that's all I've got on my list, and I think we've more or less covered all the questions on here. There were quite a lot. But I'm just having a quick look here. And I think we've pretty much covered everything. So I think we'll call it a day at that. And I'd just like to say thank you, because that really was a really enlightening talk. And certainly, look, judging by the feedback on the chat, you know, the 128 people I counted in the end that joined us really enjoyed it too. So. Thank you very much, and you know, thank you for giving up your time to talk to us this evening.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for asking.
No, no, it really has been wonderful. Could I just say before we sign off that we will be having a little bit of a break now, so there aren't any more talks lined up from Leeds Civic Trust on Zoom for the rest of the month. But of course, we do move into Heritage Open Days in September, and we've already got a talk on Eventbrite if people want to book in on that. And that's another talk from Joyce Hill, who of course gave a talk earlier on in the year. And Joyce is talking about Lost and Found, the Leeds Cross in its historical context. So you're very welcome to sign up to that now, but that's actually happening on the 16th of September. We'll be circulating probably tomorrow a video recording of this talk. So if there's anything you missed or want to listen to again, then you'll be able to do that at your leisure. There was one other request that I had during the course of the talk, which is, could we have subtitles made available for these talks? Now, it's not something we've done so far because, frankly, it wasn't something that I'm aware that we could do. But we will certainly look into that, because clearly if people are unable to enjoy the talking by listening, then having some subtitles would obviously help. So we will look into that for the next one of these talks that we do. But that's really it from us. So thank you once again, Jackie and Bob. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a very good evening. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.